Hello, this is UCL Uncovering Politics, and this week we'll be looking at cultural exports and imports, neocolonialism and injustice. Should we all be watching fewer Hollywood movies and more from the rest of the globe? Hello, my name is Emily McTurnan, and welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics, the podcast of the School of Public Policy and Department of Political Science at University College London. Global trade in cultural goods is deeply unequal. To illustrate with one striking fact, which opens the academic paper we'll be discussing today, in 2017, American films accounted for 88% of Mexico's box office, while Mexican films made up just 7%. Meanwhile, in the US, foreign language films made up only 1% of their domestic box office. And a similar imbalance is found for a range of cultural goods, from books and music to video games. And so this week we'll be asking, is there anything wrong with unequal patterns of cultural trade? What's that got to do with colonialism? And what should be done about it? Joining me today are the co-authors of a recent paper addressing precisely these questions. Dr. Shuk-Ying Chan is Assistant Professor in Political Theory here in the Department of Political Science, and regular listeners may recall Ying's last episode on resisting colonialism. And calling in from one of the most dominant cultural exporters of all, America, we have Professor Alan Patton, who is Howard Harrison and Gabrielle Snyder Beck Professor of Politics and Chair of the Department of Politics at Princeton University. Welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Thank you very much.
Let's get started by getting clear on the kind of trade we've got in mind here, trade in cultural goods. So what's included and just how unequal is the trade in cultural goods?
Yeah, so maybe I can start. So I guess by cultural goods here, we're focusing mostly on things like, as you said, like films, music, literature, video games even. And, usually these are cultural products that are commoditized and sold on the market. And just the statistics that you cited there are very illustrative of the general patterns of unequal cultural trade. So, one of the things that we talk about in the paper is how even as recently as 2004, more than 70% of cultural exports originated in Europe or North America. So this has kind of changed a bit in recent decades. So it fell around 50%, but this change was really because of two main countries, China and India. So if you exclude those countries, the patterns of cultural trade are still very much dominated by what we often call global North countries exporting to global South countries.
And is it
Emily, our definition of cultural goods follows the UNESCO definition. So as your listeners probably know, UNESCO is the UN agency that is charged with fostering international peace through education, science, and communication. I guess it's best known for preserving World Heritage sites and for its reports on the impact of wars and conflicts on cultural sites. But they also monitor international trade in cultural goods, and they define cultural goods in basically the way that Ying just said.
Fantastic. And there was a moment there where you said it's Europe, North America, and then you added, if we now ignore India and China, things still look bad. So interestingly, the paper is very much framed in terms of global South, global North. Is it justified to make those exclusions? That seems like quite a radical drop, right? From 70% being dominated to only 50%. Are we seeing a move in the right direction? What motivates you to exclude those countries?
Yeah, so I guess we're mostly focusing on countries that historically have benefited from a relationship of domination and exploitation of others. And so most obviously European colonialism. And so that's why, we try to diagnose the problem by looking along this axis of traditionally global North countries versus global South countries. I mean, there's a further question, I think, that can be asked about what happens when some global South countries are now so dominant culturally and also involved in, for example, in the case of China, involved in these relations of economic dependency between, China and Africa and Asia and so on, whether that also reproduces the problematic dynamic that we see, that we diagnose in this paper. But that's not the question that we're focused here mostly, if Alan wants to add something.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that increasing cultural exports from China and India are a step in what I think we would regard as the right direction. You could look at South Korea perhaps as another example of a relatively successful case in recent years. The point that we make at the start of our article is that many parts of the world, including Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean, other parts of Asia, remain surprisingly flat, and that's a kind of a cause of concern in the context of the broader concerns of our article, which are with global social equality.
So let's turn to this diagnosis of the problem. So your paper links this unequal trade that we've been discussing to neocolonialism. I wonder if you can tell us a bit about the main connection that you want to make between cultural goods and colonialism or neocolonialism. Is it a historic one about the history or the origins of the imbalance, or one based on a structural similarity?
Do you want me to jump in first there, Ying? Yeah, so I mean, if you start from the concept of colonialism itself, colonialism was a system of political, economic, and cultural domination by some parts of the world, Europe, the United States, Japan, over other parts of the world, in Africa, Asia, and the Americas. And it was more or less explicitly based on racism. And in the typical case, I guess with the exception of Japan, it involved majority white countries dominating majority non-white countries and extracting economic benefits from that relationship of domination. So that's colonialism. Formal colonialism is mostly a thing of the past, but since the 1960s, many have talked of neocolonialism. And we think of neocolonialism as something that, I guess, relates to colonialism both historically and structurally. So historically, the societies and countries that stand in a neo-colonial relationship are basically the same ones which stood in relations of more formal colonialism a couple of generations ago. And then structurally, neo-colonialism kind of reproduces a lot of the same inequalities that were present under colonialism. So there's the divide between the affluent and the less affluent. It remains the case that the countries that are the affluent beneficiaries of the global system tend to be majority white, whereas the countries that benefit less are majority non-white. And then finally, we argue that the imbalance in trade and cultural goods kind of coincides with this neocolonial hierarchy.
Is it coincides there, or is there a causal link you're trying to draw between the two? It just happens that this is the way the cultural exports are going and imports are going, or are we seeing a deeper rooted cause here? Colonialism, it's part of colonialism, is the explanation for why we see these cultural inequalities to the present day.
Yeah, I think that's in a sense what the article is trying to explore. And for us, maybe the hinge is this idea of social equality versus social hierarchy. So the relations of colonialism, the political and economic relations that I mentioned, are kind of grounded in profoundly inegalitarian assumptions and the absence of relationships founded in equality. And something like the same thing is true, we argue, of contemporary patterns of cultural trade and exchange.
Let's get to grip with this idea of social equality. So some of our listeners are not going to be familiar with this now incredibly popular idea in political philosophy. Would you mind briefly explaining to our listeners the core concepts and why we'd be thinking about this globally?
Yeah, so I guess I can start. I mean, so the ideal of social equality, I think, is sort of a central idea in a lot of liberal political philosophy, that the notion that, people have a duty to basically recognize and treat each other as moral equals. And, social equality, of course, is only really achievable if we have certain kinds of institutional arrangements. Like, think about the political institutions that we have. So some people argue that, we have to arrange the political institutions in a way that give everybody an equal sort of share of influence. So it's a sort of democratic institution. And, the patterns of economic wealth and so on can't be so great, that the inequality can't be so great as to make it impossible or undermine people's ability to recognize and treat each other as equals. But the central thing about social equality that we discuss is really that, it's not just a kind of relationship or status that we realize when certain institutions or distribution of material goods are in place. It's really, at the end of the day, about a kind of robust set of attitudes and dispositions that we have towards each other. So how are we disposed to see each other, treat each other, whether, we're subjected to the kind of socialization that encourage us to see other people as somehow inferior to us and so on. And so in this sense, we talk about in the article that there are two ways in which we can fail to treat someone as social equal. There's a kind of recognition failure. So this is the failure to regard the other as an equal, and a practical failure. That's the idea that you fail to arrange the world, the institutions and practices and norms in a way that actually treats other people as equal. And the sort of connection with cultural goods that we make starts with this idea of recognition failure and the role it has historically played in contexts of racialized domination, like colonialism. Yeah.
Maybe I could just add that one of the key moves in our discussion is to point out that the scope of social equality is something that needs to be kind of settled or filled in. So some theorists, when they talk about social equality, for instance, they start with a relationship between two people, like a marriage, and they ask, well, what would it mean to realize social equality in that relationship? But of course, political theorists are interested in social equality typically at the level of the state, and so they extrapolate maybe from a small group or even a pair of people all the way up to the state. And one of the arguments that we make in our paper is that actually you can think of social equality as crossing borders as well, and that we can be interested in and committed to realizing social equality with people who live in other countries. So that's an important part of our argument, because we're interested in whether the contemporary trade regime adequately realizes social equality on a global scale.
And that move to the global is such an interesting part of the paper. It did make me wonder. So in the paper, you mentioned that one of the criticisms that you sometimes get of social equality is a thought that we start with these two-person examples like your marriage case, and then somehow we extrapolate to the state and we just say, well, they're treating and regarding, and the attitudes and the behavior are just the sort of similar sort as the ones we were talking about in the two-person relations when they're between citizens. One might think that it's even more pressing for you if you go global. So are they the same behaviors and attitudes globally as they would be nationally, let alone in interpersonal relations of the kind that relational egalitarians, social egalitarians of the kind we're talking about, the people who are concerned of relating as equals to one another are really talking about?
Yeah, so I guess we do say in the paper that, although the kinds of attitudes and dispositions are pretty similar in the sense of, recognizing the other person as an equal and treating them with respect and reciprocity and so on, but the practical realization of social equality will vary across contexts. So you're right to point out that I think domestically speaking, the way that we realize social equality can be very different from globally. So for example, I think at the global level, because there is a sort of general imperative to respect each society's right to self-determination or freedom to sort of determine their own affairs, the one manifestation of treating others as equal could just be that you respect that society's own self-determination. But that doesn't mean that, and sort of non-interference is like a principle of non-interference kind of exhausts all possibilities of social equality at the global level, because we do have a lot of relationships already across borders, like economic relations. And we think about things like the human rights regime, where we are all, I guess, implicated in securing the human rights of others. And that all has to be underpinned, or is only really possible if we are able to recognize people who don't share the same domestic context as us, as equals as well. And so, yeah, even though the institutional and practical sort of implications might be different, we argue that the ideal is still morally significant.
Let's turn our attention back specifically to cultural goods. So the idea in the paper, I think there are two ideas in the paper. One is the inequality in cultural trade is bad. It's neo-colonial, which is in itself to say it's bad. And that has something to do with failures of recognition, failing to see others as equals. And you think more equal trade is going to somehow make it better. We're going to be better at social egalitarians if cultural trade is made more equal. We consume the Mexican films as often as we consume the American films and so forth. I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about each of those. So what's the failure of recognition? How does it get corrected?
Yeah, we use the term neo-colonial when we initially set up the problem, but then we note that whether or not that label is apt or not depends a little on showing that the trade pattern that we're discussing is actually objectionable. So to use a word like colonial or neo-colonial is to insinuate that there's something objectionable about it. And but that's actually something that's kind of disputed by people. Some people think that cultural goods are just another commodity, right? And that there's global division of labor and the production of different commodities, and that's just what you would expect in, I guess, a capitalist world economy, and that there's no real objection there. But so our goal is to kind of set out to counter that argument and show that there is something to be concerned about from the standpoint of social equality. And I guess, that we won't try to spell out the entire argument, but the kind of jumping off point is the observation that social hierarchies, particularly in the colonial era, were often justified by pointing to a supposed failure on the part of the colonized peoples to produce valuable culture. That was often the pretext that was given to sort of warrant the assertion that there was a social inequality there, and then that in turn was used to justify the forms of political and economic domination that ensued. And so our idea is to try to undermine through changes in the global regime of trade and cultural goods this kind of long-standing pretext for unequal relations.
Yeah, so just picking up from that, I mean, because of this historic relationship between, political domination and exploitation and so on one hand, and this idea that certain groups lack cultural achievements, we posit this hypothesis, which we don't go out, it's a theoretical paper, we don't go out and test it, but it's a hypothesis that is grounded on these historical cases that, in the case where there's a persistent imbalance of cultural flows, especially cultural goods that are highly valued and so on, between what we often call global north societies and global south societies, then that reinforces this idea that some groups lack equal capacity to produce things that are valuable as culture. And so we talk about, the idea that as social egalitarians, or those who are committed to this idea of social equality, should worry about this, because even though obviously people and citizens of the global north have an independent duty to just recognize other people as equals, regardless of whether they see any visible cultural achievements or not, the tendencies of human psychology to classify people into categories and rank them and so on is such that we also have a duty as social egalitarians to promote the conditions that encourage people to see each other as equals. And so this is how we tie it to cultural goods, and I guess think about sort of the flow of cultural goods as one small way amongst many other ways to address this problem.
So the idea here is that if the citizen of some global north country changes their consumption patterns such that they suddenly consume far more content from the global south, this will help correct their socially inegalitarian attitudes. The failure to recognize those in the global south as equally good producers of cultural products. Is that correct? That's the hypothesis.
That's the basic hypothesis. Yeah, and we try to support that hypothesis both by exploring kind of the inverse. So the idea that it's because they believe in it's because denizens of global north society tend to think that there's a lack of valuable cultural production from global south countries, that they have these inegalitarian attitudes. So that's one kind of evidence that we point to. And then we also lay out some of what we call the theoretical mechanisms that we think could connect the consumption of cultural commodities produced by global south producers with changes in the attitudes of consumers and citizens in global north countries.
One question that arises is how demanding this is of the global north viewer. So suppose I turn on Netflix and I pick something from the global south, but I'm not very aware that it's even from the global south, right? We assume it's been dubbed, or the language is going to be English. Is that going to improve my cultural attitudes? Do I need to be aware that it's from the global south? Do I need to have a further reflection about the importance of this being produced by the global south? Or is it enough for me to just be sat in front of the TV and passively consume this global?
I guess this points to the theoretical mechanisms that Alan was talking about. So I think, so we talk about sort of three mechanisms. One is just about the likelihood that when cultural goods are produced by global South producers, the content itself, the representation of people from these societies and their lives and so on, will tend to be less filled with objectionable stereotypes and so on. Now, of course, that's not always a guarantee. So in that case, perhaps even just consuming the good without knowing who created it will serve some, I guess, social egalitarian value. But importantly for our argument, there are two other mechanisms. So one is this idea that the cultural producer that produces this is exercising and displaying the fact that they have these capacities of creativity and critical thinking and so on and so forth. And it's this idea that you see someone from a group that has historically been sort of stigmatized and inferiorized and racialized, exercising these capacities, and what we call a testimony to the lie of colonial racial hierarchy, that itself exerts some force to chip away at these egalitarian attitudes. And then finally, it's not just what people see in terms of the cultural producers' capacities, but also because cultural goods are produced within a certain social environment. So the cultural producers drawing on the kinds of narratives and myths and things that are important to the group of people that they interact with regularly. So it also serves as a display of their agential capacities. And so in that sense, it is important then for the viewer to be aware of who is producing these things. And that's why it's important for, I guess, things to be credited to the right kinds of artists.
Ying and I are, I think, both quite influenced by a 19th century African-American political thinker named Martin Delany, who often thought to have been one of the first great Black nationalist writers. He published a book in the early 1850s called The Condition, Elevation, Emigration, and Destiny of the Colored People of the United States. And one of the interesting themes in that book is the relationship between what Delany calls the attainments of a people, their achievements, and the recognition as social equals. And Delany argues, he points in the book there through a number of chapters at the many different attainments of African Americans in the context of the United States, but argues that they haven't been given credit, I guess, in the eyes of the white majority for those attainments. So to go back to your question, Emily, I think sort of giving of credit is actually a really important stage in the recognition process, and it's an important part of our argument as well.
And it has a wonderful implication that you draw out in the paper as well about cultural appropriation. So listeners will be familiar with this term, right? The idea that there's something that goes wrong when we take things from other cultures. And then, of course, the long-running problem with that is that all cultures seem to draw from other cultures, right? They're not these kind of static, uniform things. We tend to draw influences from all over the place. But you guys have an answer for what's so wrong. One of the things that's wrong with cultural appropriation, and that is this lack of credit. Is that right? Does that mean that a solution to cultural appropriation is just that we all credit things more? So I had this vision of the kind of white yoga teacher who just, this comes from India at the start. Does that let them off the hook for cultural appropriation, or do they have to do more work than this?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we claim to have totally solved all the ethical puzzles surrounding cultural appropriation, but I think we do have some reservations about the kind of